Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We have a wide range of people from various organisations, I think about 150 delegates. I just want to say a few words of introduction, and my OSCR colleagues know how difficult I find it is to say just a few words, so I'll do my best. These are very challenging times for many charities across Scotland, and it's affecting them in many different ways. We're aware that many have found their income sources have greatly reduced. Others are finding huge increases in demand for their services, and lots of other impacts as well. We're trying to provide as much help and support for you as we can. So please let us know if there's more we can do to help or advise. A recent COVID-19 impact survey closed last week. Over 20% of charities have responded to it, which is a very high response rate, and we're delighted with that. And we appreciate that so many people took time to complete and submit it when they're busy doing many other things. The responses are being analysed just now, and we expect to have these soon. The results will be invaluable in helping identify the issues facing charities and to help inform policy and other responses to these. We plan to issue further surveys over the coming months to help monitor and gauge the changes in how charities are being impacted by the pandemic. Turning to today's session, I'd be handing over to Laura Anderson. Laura, and this is one of my favourite job titles, is Head of Professional Advice and Intelligence and is a expert on matters to do with accounting. She's also co-chair of the UK Charities SOC Committee. She's going to be talking about preparing accounts and reporting to OSCR in these very difficult and unprecedented times. Please remember to ask your questions on the chat facility. And Laura, over to you. Thank you.
There we go. I managed to mute myself just when you unmuted me, I think there, Paula, so apologies to everyone. A very good afternoon to everyone that's taken the time and the trouble to join us this afternoon. Can I just check in that everyone's able to hear me nice and clearly at the moment, please? If you can give me a wee nod if I can see you on the video. If you can hear me fine, that would be lovely. You probably will have noticed these pretty spectacular headphones that I'm actually wearing today. And I do feel a bit like an air traffic controller, as one of my colleagues said to me this morning. But the important thing is hopefully that you can hear me nice and clearly, so that's good. Paula, if we can move on to the first slide, please. There we go. So this is just a little bit of an overview as to what I'm going to actually cover in this presentation. And I'm only maybe going to speak for sort of maybe 10, 15 minutes because I want us to have plenty of time for everyone to kind of ask their questions that they've maybe got today that will help people move on. First of all, I want to really talk quite specifically about some of the challenges, the practical challenges that charities are actually experiencing now in terms of their annual accounts. And then I want to move on to look at the actual content of the accounts, looking firstly at the narrative trustees annual report, and then thinking also about the numbers in the accounts and how potentially your accounts could be affected by what's happened to your charity at the moment in the course of the pandemic. Then I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more about external scrutiny at this difficult time and actually how charities and auditors and independent examiners really need to cooperate and work together at this difficult time to get the job done. I'm going to then sort of round off by talking about filing with OSCR and some of the practicalities around that, and then bring us back to thinking about our guidance that we've got available and help you to understand where you can access further support. So let's make a start then. Paula, if you'd move us on, please. So, as I say, we're going to start with the practicalities. The first thing to say is that we know that if your charity or a charity that you're advising or you're working with at the moment is trying to prepare or sign off its annual accounts, that is pretty tough in trying to get some of those very simple things done. So for instance, gaining access to paper records that the charity might have that it needs to prepare its accounts might be quite difficult. Having a meeting of charity trustees on a virtual basis, maybe to consider and to approve the accounts, could be something that's very new for charity trustees and something that trustees might be a bit unsure about and a bit nervous about. So let me be really clear when I say that this is something that we really do understand and we want to try and be really practical about. And that's really been what set the scene for the guidance that we've produced in this area at this time. In terms of thinking about charities actually submitting accounts to us and the difficulties they might be having about that at the moment, it's probably helpful for me to explain that the normal practice that we have about filing accounts and highlighting late filing happens on the charities entry on the Scottish Charity Register. And normally, if a charity is late in filing its accounts, that's highlighted by a red banner at the top of the charities register entry. But at the moment, we don't think that's the right approach for us to take for charities that have been unable to file their accounts due to the pandemic. We're actively working on making changes to what the register shows at the moment for charities that have been unable to file in these recent weeks. And that will effectively allow those charities affected a 6-month period of grace before late submission is highlighted on their register entry. And it's our hope that that will prevent potential funders, donors and supporters of your charity from maybe being put off by that late submission being highlighted. The other practical thing I want to cover that I actually should have put on the slide is that we are also accepting typed signatures on accounts at the moment. So if actually what's preventing you from having your accounts completed to be able to file with us is that you can't physically get someone to sign those accounts, then you can have the typed name put in and we will accept that at this time. And that's just a small way that we think we can help overcome some of these practical challenges. Paula, could you give us the next slide, please? Thinking then about how what the charity is experiencing now affects actually what you put in the annual report and accounts, I think is a really important thing. The key thing I would say is use the opportunity that the trustees annual report provides, first of all, to actually help your readers properly understand what has happened to your charity during the pandemic and what that might actually mean for the charity going forward. I always talk, whenever I talk about the trustees annual report, and my colleagues will play testament to this, I always talk about using the opportunity to tell the charity's story. And that's what I would encourage you to do here. Help the reader to understand the numbers that are in your accounts. So when we're talking about the impact of the pandemic, help people to understand what that's done to your charity's activities. Has it increased demand for your activities? Has it shrunk demand for the activities? What's actually going on? How have your beneficiaries been affected? And what happened to the finances of your organization? Explain all of these things to your reader, because that will help them to look at the numbers in your financial statements with a much better context and a much better understanding of what those numbers are really telling them. Explain also about the impact of governance on your charity. For example, if actually you've held all of your planned trustee meetings during the course of the lockdown, but actually you've done them on a virtual basis, that's helpful for people to understand. Have you made slight changes to the way you make decisions? Again, take the opportunity to be really open and really transparent in your report in explaining that to other people. And has what's happened now changed how your charity is going to operate longer term? Has it, for example, made you think about the fact that you might want to change the services that you're delivering? You might want to change slightly how your beneficiaries access your services. What has it done for your organization? What has it done also for your plans for the future? Take the opportunity to really tell the story here. Paula, could you give me the next slide, please? So coming on then to look at the actual content of the accounts. Okay, so the first point I've kind of re-emphasized on the slide there is make sure that your trustees annual report really explains the accounts. And that is a message full stop, not just during the pandemic, but always make sure that your trustees annual report talks to your accounts and makes sense when it's compared against the numbers. If your charity is preparing accrued accounts, so that's possibly if you are a large income charity, so your income is £250,000 or more, or you're a charitable company of any size. If that's what applies to you, you will be preparing accrued accounts. If you're doing accrued accounts, at this time, you might need to have other considerations, and indeed your auditor or your independent examiner will need to be considering perhaps the going concern of your charity and whether preparing your accounts on a going concern basis is still the right thing for your organisation. This might be a particularly pertinent question if perhaps your funding is slightly uncertain going forward, or perhaps you've used up a lot of your reserves during the pandemic and you're actually going forward, again, your sustainability, your financial viability might be called into question. There might also be some consideration around what we call post-balance sheet events, okay? And these are events which generally have happened after your balance sheet date or your financial year-end date, which potentially have a very significant impact on what your financial statements really show. A good example of that would actually be if you had an investment portfolio and there had been something which had happened after your balance sheet date which had significantly impacted the value of those investments. That would be maybe something that would need to be explained in your accounts. If you're doing receipts and payments accounts, so that means your income is less than £250,000 and you're not a charitable company because companies cannot prepare receipts and payments accounts, again, you might need to consider the impact on the assets and liabilities which you have listed in your statement of balances, okay? Again, a good example of that might be that if you have an investment in something, that investment value might have dropped quite significantly at the moment. So just be aware of potentially that these figures will not look comparable to what they have done so in previous years. The last point that I've got on the slide there is about the treatment of funds that a charity might receive from government to pay staff that it has furloughed. And there have been some questions emerging about how that income that the charity has been receiving should actually best be shown in the accounts. There is no hard and fast rule about where you should categorize it in your income, for example, in your accounts. And actually, reflecting on this quite a bit, what we think is probably the best thing to do is for charities to show that income coming into the charity separately and not to necessarily group it together with other sources of income. Let it be really clear to your reader and your user of the accounts as to what you've received in, and the fact that that is a very exceptional nature, a very exceptional source of income at this time. Next slide, please, Paula. External scrutiny is the next thing I'd like to just cover briefly. Now, as we talked about earlier, sometimes gaining access to accounting records is going to be difficult. It might be difficult for charity trustees, it might be difficult for staff of a charity, but equally, if you're in the position at the moment where you are about to go through an audit or an independent examination process, for your examiner or your auditor to gain access to your records could potentially be very difficult. And I think what's important to think about at the moment is how independent examiners and auditors will need to really work very, very closely with charities that they are trying to service at the moment. And it will be really important for really strong communication and cooperation to take place by both parties at this point, really working hand in hand. I think the important thing I would say to charities at the moment is really think about how you can work very supportively and very constructively with your examiner and your auditor, but understand the job that they're trying to do. And the fact that if they're asking you for particular access to records or documentation, it's not because they're trying to be awkward, it's just because they're trying to fulfill the role that they're tasked with. At this time, there might be an impact on the opinion that an auditor is able to give on a charity's accounts. And that might be because of a going concern issue. It might be because there's uncertainty about a particular material figure in the accounts or some other matter. But again, have a good conversation with your auditor. Understand what your auditor's tasked with doing, and you know, having that really candid conversation, I think, is very important. If an auditor is going to change an opinion that they're going to put on your accounts from what you might have normally seen, it's important that you understand that and that the auditor explains that to you. Next slide, please, Paula. Okay, so coming back to some of the practicalities then, filing with OSCR. Now, While I said at the top of the presentation here that we're essentially allowing a bit of a grace period for charities that are having difficulty filing their accounts at this moment, what I want to really stress is that for charities that are able to file, we really want you to encourage to continue doing so. The online filing system that we have, which we generally call OSCR Online, is available 24/7, and that enables you to complete the annual return at any time that suits you, and to upload your account so that all your filing is completed in one seamless process, hopefully. If you are maybe trying to support other charities in online filing, think about maybe how you can walk them through using OSCR Online if they've never experienced that before. They might be a wee bit unsure and a wee bit nervous about that, but a little bit of supportive words and a little bit of a guiding hand virtually can work wonders in that space, I would say. Please try and file on time if you're able to do so. Know the date that you're legally obliged to file, which is 9 months after your financial year end. And if possible, please try and keep to that. But if you're having problems with that, please keep in touch with us. We're able to still access all the emails that you'll send to the info@oscar.org.uk email address at the moment. So if you're having issues or if you've got questions for us, please contact us through the email, and that enables us to understand what's happening with your charity. And if there are particular issues that we can support you with, then we'll do that, of course. Next slide. Thanks, Paula. Okay, so I probably bamboozled you with science at the moment and given you an awful lot to think about. So you're probably thinking, where are my points of reference? Where can I go back to find out a bit more? We've got specific COVID-19 guidance available on our website for charities, and this doesn't just cover accounting and reporting matters, but it covers a whole host of other stuff as well, such as questions that you might have about governance, questions that you might have about making changes to your charity at the moment to help you maybe support people in a different way. So the first place, if you're looking for any more guidance, first place is look at the COVID-19 guidance for charities on our website, and you can find that from the homepage. In that guidance, we've introduced a new section just in the last few days, and I think from memory it's section number 4, and that has really all the material about accounts and reporting in one place. Included in that is some guidance that we have produced as part of the charity's sort-making body, and this is to help charities that are preparing SORP accounts or accrued accounts think about some of the more technical issues that they might be encountering at this time. In addition to that, we've done some supplementary guidance working with our colleagues at the other charity regulators in the UK. And the first thing that we've developed here is some new guidance to help independent examiners at this time, because as we said earlier when we looked at external scrutiny, some examiners are finding working through the pandemic period a wee bit challenging. So we've got some new supplementary guidance in there too. Also working with our fellow regulators, we've updated the Matters of Material Significance guidance just recently. And again, you can access that through our website. All of the materials that we have, guidance materials, whether it's COVID-19 related or not, are accessible from our website. Hopefully that's been helpful. Thank you.
That's great, Laura. Thanks very much. I'm just going to unmute a couple of my colleagues and we'll get started with some questions. Okay. So Carla would like to know what platform are people using for AGMs, and are they still obliged to have one, Laura?
Okay, good question. I'm not sure I can be good at recommending a particular technical platform. I think we had questions about that at the first webinar, Paula. You'll maybe remember better than me. But in terms of whether you're still required to have an AGM or not, first thing I would say is go back to your governing document and check what it actually says about holding an AGM. If actually your governing document requires you to have an AGM, and particularly if that requires you to have the AGM maybe to sign off your accounts, then that is something that you need to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to hold it in the same way that you've traditionally held your AGM, which I would expect would have been on a face-to-face basis. You've maybe got the opportunity to have that AGM virtually, just like we're doing here now, and to maybe use that to get your accounts signed off. But again, check what your governing document says. Some of the material we have in our COVID-19 guidance also talks very specifically about holding meetings on a virtual basis and what you might need to consider if you haven't done that before. So that's maybe another good place for me to signpost you to. Paula,
Yeah.
what comments did we have about online platforms the other week?
Yeah, there's a number. So we've chosen to use Zoom because it's nice and simple, but you can use WhatsApp, you can do conference calls on that, you can use FaceTime. For those of you who want to use something that's a little bit more secure, you might want to go to a Citrix-based product such as GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting. There's an American one called Blue Jeans, which is quite popular as well, I believe. But it just depends on what requirements you as an organisation have. Zoom certainly gives some free time for people, so you would be able to hold an EGM within a certain time period. But I'm conscious, Cameron, I know that the Scouts have been given some, was it 3 months free?
We were able to agree a deal, through the Scout Association agreed a deal with Zoom for that kind of purpose, to have Zoom Pro for Scout groups. It's worth looking at. There's various options out there. Even using Skype have kind of updated theirs, and Google have just released their Premium Meet. Again, not tested it, but it's just been launched free for everybody as well if you've got a Google account, so it might be worth looking at.
Super. I know that in TFN and I think on the SCVO website, they have certainly blogged about virtual meetings, and Burness Paul as well. They've recently blogged about different platforms and how you might want to organise your AGM. So some actual practical tips on how you might go about doing that. Okay, and the next question is, how do we apply for the change of name and constitutional changes? Who would like to take that one?
I can do that one. Yes, so you can still apply. There's an application form on our website for seeking consent to change your name. Depending on the types of changes to your governing document, to your constitution, you might need to seek our consent, you might not. If you have a look on our website, it's under the managing a charity and making changes. You'll see it all detailed there. And for submitting the application, you can submit it to us electronically at the info@oscar.org.uk email address. And you can also send it with the signatures as an electronic signature as well if you aren't able to sign it, scan and print. But that should be fine.
Perfect, Cameron, because you just answered the second two parts of that, which is, what is the best email address? Which, as Cameron has said, for anything at the moment, it is info@oscr.org.uk. All our staff are still working, but we're working from home and we have some limited capability at the moment. But as soon as we are able to get back in touch with you, we will. If it is a COVID-related change of name or constitutional change, perhaps change of purpose, please make sure that you note that very clearly on the application form so we know to prioritise those ones. Jude, is there anything else that you want to add to that at all?
No, I was replying to something in the chat. Am I unmuted, Paula?
You are.
Okay. No, I think it is a case of just trying to be as clear with us as possible when there is a priority case, because we are trying very hard, and we have some good examples of where things have been turned around in a couple of days. We can't always promise that because there is quite still a volume of stuff coming in, but we will try very hard to get things dealt with very quickly when it is a COVID-related case.
Super. Thank you very much. Okay, next question's from Julie Hutchison. How do you deal with an auditor needing access to info, and that info is in an office and not available online, and that office is closed? Do you just have to wait until it's reopened? Laura, I think you touched on this earlier.
I think I did. It's not an easy one at all in terms of saying, oh yeah, everything's fine, you can just go in and get the paperwork. Potentially, I think the best thing to do is that the charity needs to make a risk assessment of the situation, essentially. And that's actually no different from the risk assessment that we've had to make as an organisation about accessing our office to gain access to some of the hard copy mail that's been coming in for the last couple of months. That's something that we didn't do initially as an organisation and have just done very, very recently in the last sort of 2 weeks, I think it is now, I'm right in saying. So the charity needs to make an assessment about what it can access, and how it can most sensibly do that. It might be the case that actually the conclusion is that the risk is not one that can be mitigated sufficiently, and therefore the audit process might have to be paused. But it's not something that there's a hard and fast rule about, but something that the trustees need to consider in terms of what's appropriate and what their situation is.
Great. There's been a wee bit more on the chat, which I think has been answered. Sorry, Jude, carry on.
No, I was just going to come in on that, if that's okay. Just to say that we have only just started, so that's important to know. So you may have something that's sort of jammed up in the backlog. It's not going to take us massively long to work through it, but I have taken a few phone calls and had a few chats this week of people who are worried about the fact that they haven't heard anything, but we will be getting through it in the next couple of weeks. And we are trying to prioritise the most priority stuff that's in there. So just to reassure people that it might take a little bit of time, but we'll get there.
That's super. Thanks, Jude. Alexandra would like to know, do you expect to see going concern uncertainty mentioned specifically in the independent examiner's report for accounts being approved during lockdown? Laura, I'm going to give that one to you.
Thanks. Again, not a hard and fast rule about this. The examiner will potentially want to think about going concern and whether that's the right basis for the charity's accounts to be prepared on. If it is the case that the examiner thinks that going concern is not the right basis, then indeed it would be appropriate potentially to mention this. But again, for me, it is all about the narrative that's used right the way through the annual report and accounts. It's about how the trustees explain the situation. It's about how the accounts are presented, the notes that support those accounts, and then the examiner or the auditor's report. These things should all come together. Claire might have other comments about this as well that she'd maybe like to share.
I suppose it depends very much on the position that the charity's in. So there may be some charities that are performing as normal throughout the coronavirus pandemic, so they might not have any going concern issues at all. So they may still be receiving funding, undertaking activities, in which case it wouldn't need to be mentioned. So it really depends on the circumstances specific to that charity, and it's something the independent examiner would have to fully consider when they're looking at it.
Okay. Does anybody have any more questions? There's nothing else in the chat that I can see at the moment that we've missed out on. Do you want to wave at me if you have something that's specifically... Oh, Alex Shields. Welcome. Wait a second. There you go. We can't hear you at the moment. You'll need to unmute.
How's that?
Right, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. The sort of demographics of my population for holding the AGM are sort of older carers, and I have been asking them if they're willing to come on to something like Zoom or Google Meet to have the likes of the AGM, but so far I've had absolutely no response from them. If we prepare the accounts and get them signed off, is it possible for me to email the accounts to them and ask for their approval or any questions to get the accounts approved within time?
Laura, do you want to take that one?
Again, I would say the first thing to do is to go back and check what your governing document actually says about the approval of your accounts. If it's allowing you quite flexibly to approve your accounts, not necessarily through a face-to-face AGM, but through maybe a slightly different mechanism, or it's quite silent about that, then that's an option that certainly I think you could look at. But again, the best place to start is to go back to the governing document and see what it says.
Good, thank you.
Lindsay, do you want to come in there?
I just wanted to put something back to Laura. Laura, you mentioned about the furlough money, but a number of charities have also had money coming through from the Wellbeing Fund, another short-term help. Do you want to say something about the treatment of that as well? Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think that is a really good point. I think for me, it's really about, again, being really transparent in the charity's accounts to help somebody else that's looking at those accounts or reading them, trying to understand them, really get to grips with what has gone on. So in many cases, I would say the best thing to do is actually to show these quite exceptional sources of income quite separately and quite distinctly on the face of the accounts. if money has come in through the Wellbeing Fund and maybe another source of kind of emergency funding not associated with furlough, it might be appropriate for the charity maybe to bring those together and maybe then to unpick and explain in the accounts maybe what came from what source. But as much as possible, I would probably say keep it simple and actually just list these things quite separately on the face of the financial statements. Claire, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. It should be shown separately within the financial statements as far as possible, so that the users have a real understanding of where money is coming from and how the charity is managing during the period.
Super. Is there anybody else with a burning question? Give me a wave and I will look for you. No. Mary?
I'm just trying to look up our constitution, but I have a feeling, I read in it, that the AGM does have to be carried out every year, and there has to be a certain proportion of members present. Now, we run, most of our members, we run lectures, for art lectures, they're all elderly. Only a portion of them are online. And I'm just wondering, even if we tried to have a meeting online, how many of them would actually join in, which means we wouldn't get the right proportion and we couldn't approve the accounts, which we have actually got done now. But what do we do then? Do we just send it in with the trustees approving it?
Laura, do you want to take that one?
I think it is a really good question. First thing I actually want to say, Mary, is well done for the fact that you've actually got your accounts prepared and pretty much finalised and ready to be signed off, because I bet there's a lot of charities that wish they had managed to achieve that. So can I just take a moment to say thank you and well done for that? Second thing to say in response to your question is I can understand the kind of anxiety or the nervousness that some people might have about participating virtually, and I don't think that's unusual at all. But essentially, if your governing document does require you to have a certain proportion of people present at your AGM and you're not able to achieve that, then actually it's not possible for you to get that accounts process probably signed off at the moment, and you might actually just have to kind of put it on pause for a little while until perhaps the control measures are slightly lifted and a meeting can be held, or maybe until people are feeling more able to participate virtually. So unfortunately, I think it's going to be the case. You're probably going to have to press the pause button just temporarily on that.
Yes, that's acceptable, except that because we run art lectures for mostly elderly people, because they're the ones who are not working, we're not going to operate for the rest of this year. There's a possibility we might be able to operate from January, or we may just put it into hibernation for a year, because a lot of our people will be elderly, vulnerable, and it's not very practical for us. The decision hasn't been made yet as to what we do, but that would mean that we'd be well over, it would be over a year, more than a year, before we could get them back.
I wonder if it might be possible to at least have your accounts process kind of signed off whenever that does become possible on a practical level, but not necessarily for that to mean that you'll start to carry on all your other charitable activities, but maybe at least your accounts process could be dealt with.
The other alternative is to send out the accounts and the descriptions for them online and ask members to email back and say, yes, they're acceptable. Is that a way of doing a sort of virtual AGM?
In some ways, I guess it might be the best that you might be able to manage at the moment. It's possibly not completely within the spirit of what we think of as an AGM, when generally people are able to hear about the questions that others ask, and that might prompt other questions or other thoughts that come out. But it might be something for trustees to think about. Lindsay, I think, has got a pearl of wisdom he's going to share with us about that.
Yeah.
I do a number of different roles, and part of it's looking at the digital transformation in central government. And what we're trying to do there is to look at how we capture all the changes organisations have been making. And I think there's something to read across to the charity sector. There are things in our constitutions that really worked 20, 30, 40 years ago. And maybe we should be all looking to say, are there things we should make simple changes to? Because I really don't think the world is going to go back to what it was. I think we need to look at different ways of doing things and making some changes to future-proof what we're all doing and make life simpler, I think might be something that's worth everyone having a look at. Thanks.
I think just there's been a couple of points in the chat that's been raised around allocating proxies. Laura, what's your viewpoint on that? So have a proxy vote. So you don't have to be there in person, but you could put in your position.
Again, I suppose it depends actually on whether your governing document says anything about that. You know, so whether it specifically says that proxies are permitted, in which case, great, and that's possible. If it specifically says proxies are not permitted, then clearly that's not an option that can be looked at. So again, it sounds like I'm you know, like a broken record, but go back to the governing document, go right back to basics, see what you've actually maybe got the ability to do and see where maybe your flexibility is there.
Great, okay. Mary, sorry, do you want to come back?
Can I apply to get the constitution changed? Is that another way out of it?
Mary, it might depend on whether you need to have a certain proportion of members, maybe to support any change to the constitution. I know it sounds like it's going in a vicious circle, doesn't it? Go back to the governing document, see whether it's got that ability, because that might be an option that you could look at that would enable you to kind of break that vicious circle. Lindsay's got something else to say here too.
I said I'd shut up. There was a question there about, can we get legislation changed which would allow proxies or different ways of doing this, regardless of what Constitution says? I think it's a fascinating question. And I think it would be Scottish legislation, but I wondered if, Laura, you wanted to add anything on that. Because certainly we have been looking to say, are there things that we can get changed in governing legislation? There are some limitations on that, but if it was a realistic one, then I would have no difficulty in going back and saying to the government, I think we should do it differently.
Actually, just about at time,
Sorry,
guys.
Paula.
So that's okay. I really do not like not being on time. So I'm going to ask Lindsay just to say a couple of things to wrap us up. I will be taking a copy of all the chat. So if there's something that hasn't been covered here today, it will be sent to our guidance manager and things will be updated. And we will be holding more of these events. So in the next few moments, while Lindsay wraps up, if you can put in any ideas that you guys have of anything that you want to hear about from the regulator in the next kind of 9 months, feel free to let us know what that is. Lindsay, I'll let you finish off.
Thanks, Paula. That point about legislation is obviously one that we will be looking hard at and we can put something out on. But I just wanted to say thank you to Laura for the presentation, to Paula and colleagues for helping out, and thank you to everyone for joining in. I do hope you found this helpful. Remember, as Paula said, tell us through the chat about other things you think it would be useful to have these sessions on, and we hope to see you at another event, by which time I'm hoping to do an impersonation of someone with very, very long white hair as it gets closer to my shoulders every week we go. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Cheerio.